Black propaganda is one of the many tools in the agitprop toolbox. It is also the most underrated tool in the realm of political warfare because the establishment convinced non-leftists that it is immoral to use it, while at the same time the New York Times, a former newspaper, runs black propaganda almost daily. Admittedly, black propaganda is not for everyone. In order for it to be effective, one needs to thoroughly understand the opposition. But if done right, it is devastating to the opposition, especially when talking about big numbers. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, since I'm making this video in English and about 40% of the people who will be watching this will be from the United States, I need to mention this right from the get-go. Black propaganda has nothing whatsoever to do with black people or the black race or anything related to racial politics. And the reason I need to point this out is two-tiered. First, because there are too many people who see race everywhere, including and especially where they shouldn't. And secondly, because the mainstream tries to falsely attribute the existence of black propaganda to fascism in general or to Adolf Hitler in particular, even though the technique is older than Germany's existence. So, in order to maintain some structure here, we'll split this video into 4 parts. 1. What is black propaganda? 2. Modern day uses of black propaganda. 3. How to spread black propaganda yourself. And 4. Some conclusions. So with that, let us begin. So if you Google the term black propaganda, the Wikipedia article that pops up says the following, quote, "Black propaganda is false information and material that purports to be from a source on one side of a conflict but is actually from the opposing side. It is typically used to vilify, embarrass, or misrepresent the enemy. Black propaganda contrasts with gray propaganda, the source of which is not identified, and white propaganda, in which the real source is declared and usually more accurate information is given, albeit slanted, distorted, and omissive. Black propaganda is covert in nature in that its aims, identity, significance, and sources are hidden. The major characteristic of black propaganda is that the people are not aware that someone is influencing them and do not feel that they are being pushed in a certain direction. Black propaganda purports to emanate from a source other than the true source. This type of propaganda is associated with covert psychological operations. Sometimes the source is concealed or credited to a false authority and spreads lies, fabrications, and deceptions. Black propaganda is the big lie, including all types of creative deceit. Black propaganda relies on the willingness of the receiver to accept the credibility of the source. If the creators or senders of the black propaganda message do not adequately understand their intended audience, the message may be misunderstood, seem suspicious, or fail altogether, close quote. Well, that definition is incomplete for starters, and misleading. Yes, black propaganda is in part covert psychological operation, and it is typically used to vilify or embarrass the enemy. Where the definition provided by the Wikipedia goes wrong is their insistence that black propaganda is the dissemination of false information or that it is typically used to misrepresent the enemy. That's just not true, or at least not true in most cases. For instance, if you were to make a Black Lives Matter website in which you would glorify the murder of white people and praise every black supremacist you can find on Twitter, would that be misrepresentation or false? Of course not. Black Lives Matter is an anti-white militant terrorist organization. Yes, such an undertaking would vilify and embarrass BLM and would qualify as black propaganda because you wouldn't disclose the source of the praise. But it wouldn't involve lying or misrepresentation, yet that wouldn't make it any less black propaganda. So that's the false part of the definition. The incomplete part is where they fail to mention other forms of black propaganda, such as intentional omission. This is the kind of black propaganda that the New York Times runs consistently, and not just them. There are a plethora of purulent rags that do it, whether consciously or not. One stellar example of this is their extensive coverage of Richard Spencer whenever he farts, and oftentimes even when he doesn't fart, and then carefully induce to their credulous audience that Richard Spencer represents not just the entirety of the alt-right, which in itself is a lie, but the entirety of the Trump base, which is demonstrably a lie, and maybe even all non-leftists in general, which is an egregious lie. Now, I'm not into conspiracy theories myself, yet it begs the question, how come the chief of a minuscule think tank of 11 people became the darling of the cathedral media on this? Now, I don't want to speculate on this since it's really off topic, but it is nonetheless a legitimate issue. What makes this an instance of black propaganda, though, is the large degree of omission. The editorial boards who decide these things know for sure that whatever Spencer says is not clearly representative even for the alt-right, yet they continue to push it anyway because it is convenient for the narrative they want to push. Now, admittedly, some may argue that what the New York Times is doing could be classified as white propaganda because the sources are transparent and more accurate information is given, albeit omissive and slanted. I don't mind if you would agree with that, but I don't agree because the sources are not transparent. Who funds the New York Times? Well, we don't know. The Mexican magnate, touted as the owner, well, owns 70% of the paper. The historical Jewish Schultzberger family owns even less than that. 70% of the ownership is not accounted for. Also, who okays these propaganda outputs? We don't know. So that's why I believe what the New York Times is doing is also black propaganda by the definition. But anyway, that's a minor point. Another method also left out from the Wikipedia definition is the preferential support, or in more common parlance, buying off your own mouthpieces. One example of this is the Duginist method. If you remember from the video about Duginism, I mentioned a chap named Konstantin Malofeev, who is essentially the Russian equivalent of Soros Georgiou. But what Malofeev is doing under the guidance of Dugin is slightly different. Soros buys people to speak for his agenda. Malofeev does that too, but he also funds mouthpieces that are apparently in opposition to his agenda. Through his company, Marshall Capital Partners, he funds a multitude of allegedly liberal bloggers who push the usual liberal lefty content, and suddenly, out of the blue, they have the correct opinions on Crimea, Putin's abuses of power, and so on and so forth. Mind you, Malofeev is not the only one who does that. Alexander Evgenievich Lebedev, former KGB agent, owns The Independent and the London Evening Standard, one conservative and one leftist newspapers, both with audiences that are, at least in theory, opposed to the KGB's agenda. The way this works is basically the papers are allowed to stay as they were unless there is a political project in the working, as Dugin would put it. So when it comes to stories that are of interest to the KGB, watch the conservative and the liberal newspapers become indistinguishable. That, my fellow deplorables, is a form of black propaganda, and quite a successful one at that. Alright, since this is a topic that is best understood via practical examples, rather than long and boring academic types of exposés, let's move to the second part of the video, where I'll give you more examples of modern-day uses of black propaganda. So, the most recent example, and the one I love and hate the most, is the Medusa Magazine. As I'm sure most of you already know, the Medusa Magazine was started as a satirical publication meant to poke fun at feminism. The publication was started by the individual who also runs the Age of Shitlords blog. However, the founder decided to shut down the publication after bits of the satire became legit arguments used by legit feminists in the Washington Post. If you're not familiar with the story, I'll leave links in the low bar for further documentation on the issue. But for the purposes of this talk, Medusa Magazine is an example of successful black propaganda. Unintentional, but black propaganda nonetheless. And this is what I hate about it, that the author got scared and shut it down instead of doubling down on it. I get it that it wasn't his intention to have a black propaganda outlet, but one ought to adapt as one goes. And if you see success, you put more out of that, not less. The Medusa Magazine example is also pertinent to the criticism brought earlier to the Wikipedia definition of black propaganda. What Medusa Magazine did was not a lie. They basically insinuated that feminists legitimately believe that sexual assault by men against women is no big deal if leftist men do it. And the feminists rushed to agree, in the pages of the Washington Post, no less. On a more serious note, though, Medusa Magazine was on its way to becoming the most successful tool of subversion when it came to destroying feminism's cultural sway. Not the way the founder intended, but the way it was actually playing out in the marketplace of ideas. Because if enough people had read them and took it for granted that it was a legit feminist publication, and the same people had seen identical arguments in mainstream papers, that situation had the potential to halve the total number of feminists once in 2 years and multiply that number of anti-feminists within the same period. Really sad. The shutdown of Medusa Magazine is a terrible loss for modern-day black propaganda in service of the normal majority. And I'm not joking. Alright, another example of modern-day propaganda is one that I gave in previous videos, I think in the video where I explained agitprop, if I'm not mistaken. The example is the fake Hillary posters used on Twitter during the first Great Meme War, otherwise known as the presidential elections campaign of 2016. Now, it is difficult to assess the success of this particular piece of black propaganda, but what I can say is that using them, I personally convinced 2 people not to vote for Hillary, just using these posters. If everyone using them had half of the success, then that's still huge. Now, that's not to say that the target audience bought the posters hook, line, and sinker, but it is to say that the posters were an act of black propaganda since they were embarrassing and vilifying the opposition without misrepresenting it. I mean, after all, it was Hillary's on-record position that women should be drafted, so there was no lie involved. It was just putting into pictures in a way that would shock the fence-sitter who might have been tempted to vote with the darkness. A more prominent and also less known example is Milo Innopolis. Now, I do realize that this is controversial to say, but it's something widely understood amongst serious ideologues and oftentimes openly admitted. Mind you, that doesn't mean all of Milo's activity is black propaganda, just the latest 10 months or so, ever since he became the primary project of David Horowitz. Again, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, quite the opposite. I am thrilled that this is happening. And it is possible entirely because David Horowitz is basically a very old version of myself, with the notable exception that he actually believed in communism. But otherwise, he's of similar background. He got the chance to observe communism from the inside and decided at one point that enough is enough and that the old non-leftist tactics of civility, calm dialogue, and fair play are simply not going to work against an opposition whose goals is to undermine capital C civilization itself. David Horowitz is using his capital to flip the tables and bring agitprop, black propaganda, and even various forms of active measures, or активные мероприятия, into the arsenal of the non-left. Now, if you don't know what активные мероприятия are, I suggest you go watch the long interview that KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov gave to the media in the 1980s called Deception Was My Job. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with that, but those who aren't, please do watch that interview if you want to know what the active measures are. Anyway, back to the topic. Milo's work since he joined David Horowitz's organization has very distinct elements of black propaganda in it. Unlike the period from Breitbart when the sole purpose was to trigger the left and generate headlines, this time around, the operation of which Milo is just the front of it is focused on much more established objectives. For instance, you will see that the speeches are shorter, the presentation style is slightly different as well. While in the past you would see Milo citing a long stream of statistics and facts wrapped in a good joke, as he would say, Now you see him presenting his case as a story. That's not by accident. Black propaganda means telling a good story. So good that the audience will want to learn more. But the true element of black propaganda in the Milo operation is his printing label, Dangerous, which is basically an entire machine of using left-wing tactics against the left. The whole purpose of that label is to subvert the mainstream. Will it succeed? I don't know, but it's a damn good start, and that's for sure. Alright, another example of modern-day black propaganda, the Domestic Investigations and Operations Guide. Don't know what that is? Well, get ready, because this is going to sound creepy as hell, but it is nonetheless true, as of January 2017, is also a matter of public record. Links, of course, in the low bar. Mind you, this became public in January last year, but many of us were aware of it for over a decade, especially those of us who know how these things work. So, the Domestic Investigations and Operations Guide is the previously secret rulebook of the FBI. The FBI was forced to publish most of it because several groups sued and won. That's an interesting story in and of itself for those who care. I don't, and for the purpose of this talk, it's irrelevant. The point is that the document everyone had a strong suspicion that it exists, turns out that it does exist. So the Domestic Investigation and Operations Guide, or DIOG, is a monster document of several hundreds of pages which details everything about how the FBI conducts its covert operations. The table of contents only is 27 pages long. The whole document exceeds 600 pages of very small font. Now, they don't have a chapter about black propaganda, but they do have extensive guidelines of what constitutes a legitimate organization. However, they also have exceptions for whenever an agent believes an organization is not legitimate. What does that mean? Well, it means that if an FBI agent wants to infiltrate into your organization and sabotage it from the inside, that's his prerogative, and there's nothing you can do under the law. In their own language, quote, participation is undisclosed when anyone acting on behalf of the FBI, including but not limited to an FBI employee or CHS, participates in the activity of the organization on behalf of the USG without disclosing FBI affiliation to an appropriate official of the organization. A CHS who participates in an organization entirely on his own behalf and who is not tasked by the FBI to obtain information or engage in other activities in that organization is not engaging in undisclosed participation, regardless whether the CHS volunteers information to the FBI and regardless of whether the CHS's affiliation with the FBI is known. If the CHS is tasked to obtain specific information or to take specific action, his/her participation to fulfill that task is on the behalf of the FBI, close quote. Translation. If there is no official order, then that means the informant was there on his own accord from a legal standpoint, and thus nobody is legally responsible. What does that mean in practice? Well, how about FBI agents being on the scene on the side of the Islamists trying to kill Pamela Geller and doing nothing about it? But okay, that's an ongoing case, and it appears that finally the agent is doing something at the trial, so let's leave that aside for a moment. There are others, both past and present. The most widely known is the Count Cointelpro, which was essentially textbook black propaganda. FBI operatives infiltrated all sorts of movements, all of them collectivists, from the KKK to black nationalists, from the Communist Party to the feminists, and essentially produced documents that exaggerated the claims of the movements they had infiltrated and attempted to divert their focus, divide their coalition, and ultimately neuter their effects. Now, officially, between 1976 and until earlier 2017, Cointelpro didn't exist. Now, as we look through these documents, it leaves no shadow of doubt that some form of Cointelpro continues to exist and has been in existence contiguously. The targets have changed somewhat. I mean, the FBI no longer seeks to undermine feminists, sadly, but it continues to apply the same tactics on militant environmentalists, all racial supremacist organizations, white, black, Indian, and so on, and a hand-picked list of organizations that are communist but also have other goals in mind. With this information in mind, you should re-evaluate the stories of the alleged looming danger of white nationalism and the KKK. Heck, I would even be surprised if there are more than 100 legit members of the KKK left, with all the rest being various forms of subversion plans. And I'm only half joking. I mean, if the FBI was able to infiltrate a black man into the KKK as far back as 1979, to believe that the KKK today is anything but neutered boogeyman to scare the normies is just nuts. You know what else is nuts? The cathedral media is scared that there is a widespread operation of white supremacists to infiltrate law enforcement. There is, of course, no evidence of that going on as a serious and coordinated operation. There is, however, a vast amount of official evidence about the opposite happening. I would go on for another hour with examples, but I think these examples are enough to make the point about what black propaganda means in practice. Alright. So now let's go to my favorite part of this video, how to do it yourself. I mean, the purpose of these videos is, after all, to arm everyone, not just with the knowledge of these things existing, but also with the knowledge on how to apply them. Now, as said at the beginning, black propaganda is not for everyone and it's not the easiest tool in existence. Things may look particularly discouraging if one looks at the examples I provided, all of them being incredibly expensive and oftentimes requiring full-time, hands-on involvement. So I understand why very few people get on board with this on practical grounds. However, just because we cannot do what the FBI is doing, we also need to acknowledge that we don't need to either. I mean, after all, our goals are less revolutionary. We just want to be left alone and we'd prefer less leftist nonsense into the curricula of our children. Now, by the standards of the current year, that's revolutionary in and of itself, but it is less spectacular than what the FBI was dealing with, and also less spectacular than the cases supported via active measures by the Soviet Union. So with that in mind, let's get to the list of 5 things you can do to apply black propaganda. Number 1, amplification. Now, one of the good things in our situation, from a black propaganda perspective, is that we don't have to lie, like, at all. For instance, the website The Root, which is a legit black supremacist publication, essentially the Daily Stormer for Negroes, that website should be amplified. While I was researching for this video, I was thinking that, man, if The Root hadn't existed, we would have had to create it. It is really that good. It is both literally and figuratively black propaganda. Anyway, so, since The Root already exists, and for all intents and purposes it is a serious publication on which the writers are to be presumed to mean what they say, all we need to do is amplify them. This is, mind you, a tactic I was personally involved in using against feminists. A significant proportion of my work in the trenches against feminism, not now, but in 2010, 2011, when questioning feminism wasn't halal, and when most of the prominent anti-feminists today were probably feminists themselves. So a prominent portion of my work back then was to just amplify what the feminists were saying. Of course, I would purposefully select publications that were serious and direct. The contrast those with so-called moderate feminist writings, which were essentially broadcasting the same message, but in a more tone-policed and polished way so as to not to scare the normies. This tactic is called moving the middle, and it is widely practiced by leftist, collectivist, and revolutionary movements, particularly the more violent variety. And the tactic worked. More and more normies over the course of several years started to question things. Hold on a second, what do you mean all sex is rape? What do you mean listen and believe? Hold on, I have a nephew who has been falsely accused of rape, and I know the bitch lied. And on and on and on, individual by individual. The whole thing rolled on and continues to roll on to this day. The same needs to be applied to the wider left. The example with the Root is the most obvious one. The Root is the black supremacist equivalent of the lesbian separatist and lesbian supremacist RadFem hub back in the days. Look up Agent Orange files to learn more about that. So, how can you do amplification? Well, set up several social media accounts. Get them all, Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, and so on and so forth. Make those accounts as seemingly leftist as possible. Subscribe to all the usual leftists, retweet or share some of their crap to establish credence. That takes about 3 weeks with 30 minutes per day of work at the most. Then once you establish that, then you start amplifying your target. It's more credible if you focus on a single topic. In my example, black supremacy, but it can be other topic like transgender disorder or whatever. And then aggressively amplify and add comments of your own that further reinforce and preferably expand on the points made in the article you share. For example, at the moment of this recording, on the front page of The Root stands an article titled "Long Live the Chairman. On this day in 1969, the FBI and Chicago police assassinated Black Panther Fred Hampton," in which the revolutionary Maoist agitator and anti-white racist Fred Hampton is praised as a hero of the proletariat. I wish I were joking. Now, a black propaganda operation would share that article alongside with a commentary blaming all white people for his death. It's not something I came up with. I drew inspiration from the comment section. It's what the legit fans of this publication genuinely believe, and we should amplify that, because sunlight is the best disinfectant. Now, if you decide to use this, please make sure you choose a topic that you know very well. If you don't know how to race bait, then don't use this example. Use something else. For instance, the transgender insanity. You can use Trans Advocate website, a very legitimate mainstream LGBTs publication that publishes the kind of batshit insanity that at least 90% of the human race would see as dangerous right from the get-go, which is precisely why it should be amplified in a black propaganda operation. Again, we don't have to lie. That's a conservative privilege right there. The previous users of the black propaganda were nowhere near as lucky as we are. Alright, number 2, infiltration. Now this one is a lot harder to do. Last time I saw it effectively used was during the Agent Orange files operations. Links of course in the low bar. This one requires time and dedication, and it is bloody hard to do it in one person. Agent Orange was a team of several people who put in many hours to get themselves inside the hornet's nest. For the purposes of our ideas, there are 2 possible ways. One is to infiltrate in order to leak information to the rest of the troops, and the other is to infiltrate in order to reach leadership and then move to discredit. Both are very difficult, and while oftentimes they don't require a lot of money, they do require a lot of time and people. The most recent example that I can give here was the election of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the British Labour Party. Hashtag Tories for Corbyn was a real thing. Now admittedly, that campaign started as a black propaganda operation, but in the end it became a white propaganda operation, but still, it worked. Labour will get in power right about never for as long as Corbyn is there. But that's a high-profile example. Smaller things can also be done. For instance, and this is for continental Europe, if you have a local council dominated by a leftist party, find out who is the most despised in the place. For example, many parishes or districts in Sweden are ruled by the Green Party. If I had it my way, I would join the Green Party and make sure to subvert their internal conference so they'd put the looniest candidate possible on the ballot. Meanwhile, I would run an awareness campaign to make sure the electorate knows just how loony things have gotten. This worked in several small elections in the Netherlands where I provided intellectual support. I see no reason why it could not work elsewhere as well. Now, infiltration is, metaphorically speaking, a crime of opportunity. Not everyone has to do it, and not everyone has something to infiltrate into. That's why all I'm saying in this video needs to be taken alongside the rest of the Practical Politics series and not in isolation. And since it is opportunity dependent, you will need to assess on your own whether it's worth doing it. For instance, I have coordinated infiltration efforts into every single far-left group formed into my hometown. And I'm honest about it. The purpose is to drive them into the ground before they even open their mouths in public. With one exception, it worked impeccably. This is another thing to keep in mind. It's not a flawless tactic, and it is environment dependent, but failure must not discourage you. There's always another day to fight. Alright, number 3, controlled opposition. Okay, this one is also emphasizing that black propaganda is a tool from the wider toolbox of agitprop. Now, when you say controlled opposition, people look at you as some conspiracist loon. But the fact of the matter is that it's not uncommon at all. It's just that people who look for controlled opposition almost always look in the wrong direction. Controlled opposition rarely takes the form of big organizations who are essentially pawns. Yes, Lenin did that, but Lenin was a special case. And dare I say, in very unique and special circumstances. Most of the time, though, controlled opposition is actually happening on a much smaller scale. Now, depending on your goal, this can be quite inexpensive, both time-wise and money-wise. Let me give you an example. Suppose you live in a city or town where the local council holds meetings with the public. This actually works better in bigger cities that do this, because in bigger cities you have, ironically, a smaller number of people whose arguments you need to defeat. Let's say you have a city sale tax of 5% or property tax or whatever. This is just an example. It works on almost all types of local policies, including taxes. Now, ideally that tax should be 0, but you won't get 0. However, via agitation with controlled opposition, you can easily get from 5% to 2%, especially if you have public debates. The formula is simple. Depending on the size of the crowd, make sure you have at least 5% of the crowd filled with your people. Make sure you choose the loudest people possible. Then split your troops evenly in the venue where the public consultation takes place, and also split your troops into 80% for the controlled opposition and 20% for your real position. So in a crowd of 100 people, I would have 6 of my own. 2 of them will argue vehemently for a 0% tax, and 6 of them will act as opposition to my radical idea and will argue for the reasonable compromise of a tax between 1.5% and 2%. The role of the controlled opposition is to also drive out any legit opposition. So if anyone would like to keep the 5% tax, the controlled opposition's job is to make them shut up or scream louder and cover them. If done right, this approach undercuts the need for a debate on whether the tax should be lowered in the first place, and in effect, you shift the fundamental premise of the whole discussion into your territory. One example of this being done by the left was explained in the video The False Civil Society, in which basically militant anti-alcohol loons controlled both sides of the debate, thus eschewing the side that believed in freedom altogether, and instead narrowed the debate exclusively into extremist leftist nanny state territory. Alright, let's move to number 4, impersonation. This is classic black propaganda. Basically, create an outlet from scratch and pretend to be your opposition with the purpose of attracting fans of the opposition and slowly subvert them. Now, I personally never had the resources, particularly the time, to do this, but I do intend to get involved in the coming years into several projects of this nature. One idea I'm toying around with is to get a pro-EU Islamist publication up and running. The purpose would be to get some latent radicals to become more visible and also to show the general public how the very existence of the European Union and the Islamist agenda are essentially the same thing. Such an undertaking would require enormous resources, though, especially at the beginning. I also need something that is hard to find, namely a conservative that lives in Europe, understands black propaganda, understands Islam, and speaks Arabic. Such people do exist, but their services aren't cheap. However, depending on your local circumstances, you might engage in this at a smaller level. For instance, if your country allows that, mine doesn't, sadly, not yet anyway, you could create a local leftist political party to act as opposition from the left to the established leftist party. This is very useful if you already have a decent non-leftist alternative on the local market, and by local I mean at city or town level, country at the most. Creating a national party, even in small countries, is really expensive and, for the time being, beyond their reach. Now, I wish I had more to say on number 4, but since I haven't done this myself yet, I don't have much insight to offer. Anyway, finally, number 5, lateral approach. This is a less efficient but still workable version of number 2. Only instead of infiltrating the organization itself, you infiltrate one of their partners. For instance, 3 mayoral candidates in my country lost essentially because their campaign managers were foolish enough to take slogan suggestions and advice from their print shop. And the print shop was run by friends of mine. That was probably the easiest black propaganda operation in history. I admit I got lucky, but it bloody worked. And again, it was a crime of opportunity, so to speak, since I had no way of knowing that those candidates would print their materials at businesses owned by friends of this operation. But since they showed up to place an order, I was like, why not? It's worth a shot. In another local election campaign over 10 years ago, another friend of mine accepted the contract of a really nasty political party to host a mixed event, namely an event that was partly political, connected to that party, and the rest was public related and less connected to that party. Only the venue had to say they were financed or hired by the political party in question, which runs candidate X for the mayor's office. The problem for that candidate was that in the contract it didn't say my friend had to say anything nice about him. It only said he has to say the event was paid by that candidate. So he instructed his staff to say just that, right before reiterating that socialism is cancer and mentioning some of the controversies that candidate was involved in. Needless to say, the party wasn't happy. It cost them almost 5 percentage points at the ballot box, just enough for their candidate to finish 3rd and miss out the 2nd round. Now, these things are not always easy to do, but if you pay close attention all the time, you'd be surprised how many opportunities of lateral approach do present themselves even over the course of a regular year, but especially during an election season. And again, the great good thing is, if you're of a similar persuasion with me, is that you never have to lie. Not even lie through omission, just lobby to insert the truth at the right time. That's it. Although again, I have no qualms in using deception, gossip, and any other non-violent and legal tool when it comes to socialists. Fighting fair against the left ends in one way, with freedom losing. I'm not here to lose before the fight even begins. Just saying. Alright, so for the conclusions part, let me just say this. The entirety of this video is highly controversial even among non-leftists / right-wing circles. It won't be controversial 10 years from now, I guarantee you that, but for the time being, this is not mainstream material. Such is the depth of the demoralization that runs through our ranks. The reason I maintain a high level of optimism is because I've seen tangible progress happening, even if much slower than I wanted to. Also, one needs to remember that we're fighting with a 100 years handicap. The agents of totalitarianism have been around for between 75 and 120 years, depending on the country from which you're watching or listening to this. And for the vast majority of that period, they had no opposition or a small, fragmented, and inefficient opposition. Here in the Intermarium, the entirety of the opposition was killed. In the former Western Bloc, it was merely silenced, and that was possible partly because the opposition was weak in the first place. I mean, even today, there are so many on the mainstream right who genuinely believe that writing an essay in the National Review counts as doing something. Imagine, that was the only opposition for decades. But anyway, as we go forward, things are changing and will change. If you're in your teens or early 20s, you might even live long enough to see the results of all of this. But make no mistake, this conflict will not be over. Ever. It's a conflict that's been around since the dawn of human civilization, and the best we can hope for, as I explained over 2 years ago in the video How Can Liberty Win?, The best we can hope for it is to get much better at keeping the dirt of socialism at bay. And that is doable. Not easy, but doable. And one of the reasons for it not being easy is because the side of liberty will always be understaffed. And that's a story for another video, which I guess I hope I'll get the time to also make. But until then, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. If you derive any value from these videos and you can afford, please do consider throwing a shekel. Please do subscribe to my social media. And I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.